Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to another exciting episode of Fighting Game Thursday. Over the last few weeks on the channel, we have been going through the history of some of SNK's fighting games. We started this trend out by looking at 1991's Fatal Fury, a game that was directed by Takashi Nishiyama, the same man who had previously directed Street Fighter for Capcom back in 1987. The Street Fighter connections did not end here though, as the following week we looked at Art of Fighting, an SNK fighting game that was released in 1992 under the leadership of Hiroshi Matsumoto, a gentleman who had worked on both Street Fighter and Fatal Fury previously, and had even invented the Hadouken. Today we are going to be looking at yet another fighting game released by the same company over that sort of time period. The game in question is of course Samurai Shodown, a game that would stand out from the pack due to being SNK's first arcade fighting game to focus primarily on weapon-based combat. So, with SNK's experience in creating fighting games, paired with a new cool weapons gimmick along with a superb samurai theme, was this all enough for the game to destroy all enemies and be known as one of the most refined fighting games on the planet? Well, let's find out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Samurai Shodown, the weapons-based fighter. Yeah! As mentioned more times than I can count in my fighting game content, Street Fighter 2, along with its innovations in the world of gaming, proved there was a great deal of money to be made from the fighting game genre. This would set the wheels in motion for new fighting games to be commonly released right up until this very day. One of the best companies out there when it came to creating great fighters was of course SNK, who, you could argue, often went toe-to-toe with Capcom in terms of quality. To be able to achieve this feat, the company would be constantly innovating and coming up with interesting ways to improve the genre, and presenting new games in ways that were quite different to what consumers had seen previously. Samurai Shodown is a prime example of this, as in contrast to the most popular fighting games of the day, which were set in modern times and focused primarily on hand-to-hand combat, Samurai Shodown is set in feudal era Japan and primarily focuses on weapons-based combat instead. The game, that story takes place in the late 18th century, features comparatively authentic music to reflect the era it represents, beautiful backdrops that illustrate the environment, and a character roster each of which wields a different weapon. Interestingly, rather than being a game that was simply created to one-up the level of violence found in many other fighting games, the title's development process was a little more complex than that. So, let's cover the early phases of the creative cycle that would lead to Samurai Shodown. Yasushi Adachi, the lead designer who worked on Samurai Shodown, has stated in the past that the game originally did not even begin development as a fighting game, and the final product is far removed from what was originally conceived. In the early days of the game's conceptualization, Yasushi wanted to create a beat-em-up like Double Dragon or Streets of Rage, themed around monsters fighting. In the earlier phases, the game was set to star a monster known as Genan, who would fight against other monsters. From this period of development, this character, who was partially based on Edward Scissorhands, would be all that remained from the original game's concept, and all other monsters would be dropped. Yasushi states that the game would evolve into a completely different concept due to the following. When I was creating the concept for a monster game, I was contemplating what would sell to a global audience. I ultimately felt that a fighting game with ninjas and samurais, which represented distinctly Japanese characters, would do better than just monsters, so I changed the concept accordingly. In this same interview, he would also explain as to why the inclusion of weapons was so important in the game. We wanted to illustrate the terror of fighting weapon to weapon, the impact of fighting with a sword in the game. That's why the damage of being cut by Hayumoru's sword is significant in the game. the player loses over half of their life gauge when successfully cut by a sword. Devastating weapon attacks that do so much damage to either the player or their opponents was new to the fighting game genre, and due to this, Yasushi would mention, there was a lot of internal criticism about deducting so much life gauge with one attack. SNK management said this design had to be changed, but I thought it was very interesting to have players fight under the risk and fear of fighting with weapons, and feel the destructive force of the sword, so I ignored them and kept it in the game. In regards to the game's controversial mechanic, Yasushi goes on to note that such a mechanic probably would struggle to make it into modern games, due to the current obsession with balance and consistency. He also mentions that creatively, developers' hands are more tied today due to quality assurance divisions tweaking games based on market research and focus groups, overall making fighting games much more uniform now. In regards to the development feedback loop of the day, Yasushi states, I would watch and record people playing the game at the arcades, and then take it back to the office and analyse the footage. But honestly, I didn't care. I have to say personally, from all I have read, I now have a lot of respect for Yasushi, as I adore a man who so stubbornly sticks to what he wants to create, regardless of what other idiots often have to say about it. To quote the man once again, he states that the industry was growing and there was a lot of freedom for the developers. It was a very exciting and fun time. Another key member of staff working on this game was Tomoki Fuki. One of his key roles on the Samurai Shodown product was to create stages that would not only appeal to a Japanese audience, but make the title appealing for players all over the world. In regards to Samurai Shodown, Tomoki mentions that he remembers Sasushi regularly instructing him to stay aware of maintaining a sense of reality, especially around characters like Jubi Yagyu or the boss character Shiro Amakusa and other characters based on real people. He wanted to make sure that the game wasn't all fantasy and stayed true to some real life events and each character's real world environment. Tomoki also touches on one of the game's main fighting mechanics, covering the development of the game's rage gauge system. He mentions that I have a story that's quite popular when I'm asked about Samurai Shodown. I think Samurai Shodown was the first fighting game to have a sub-gauge. Adachi came up with the idea, but the inspiration for the gauge came when the dev team was all playing Street Fighter 2 together for research purposes. Adachi and I were playing against each other, and I frustrated him because I won. Adachi was so mad because he lost that he was silent for a minute. Then he suddenly got up and shouted, "Ikari Gauge!" So we took that frustration, that anger and rage that players feel when they lose a battle and decided to incorporate it into the game. That was where the inspiration for the rage gauge come from. Beside the spirit bar that had featured in Art of Fighting 1 year prior, the rage gauge helped pioneer the way forward for the fighting game genre by becoming one of the first bars that offered players in the field benefits beyond combos and special moves, overall adding to Samurai Shodown's competitive nature. To explain this mechanic in more detail, players' rage gauges fill as they take damage. When the gauge is completely filled, characters' skin change to red and they are awarded further power, allowing them to inflict more damage than normal in this desperate state. There are further mechanical features that help Samurai Shodown stand out further from the competition too, which we shall soon get into, but first I would like to touch on the game's story. In both Fatal Fury and Art of Fighting's case, they placed a heavier emphasis on storytelling than that of Street Fighter 2. Samurai Shodown is no different really, as several cutscenes are interlaced between the game's contests to give the game a sense of narrative progression. The story of this title focuses around real-world events of the past. Basically in Japan in 1683, Amakusa Shiro, a man who would go on to become Japan's most famous Roman Catholic, led a tax rebellion against a dictator known as Tokugawa Shogunate. This dictator, who violently prohibited Christianity, would raise taxes to extreme levels so that he could build a castle, which would lead to the Shimabara tax revolt. Through this period, Tokugawa Shogunate would slay Amakusa Shiro. The the 17-year-old leader of the rebellion. He basically ended up having his head displayed on a pike near Nagasaki as a warning to Christians going forward. Whether you are deemed a freedom fighter or terrorist, in some cases simply relies on a point of view, and upon doing some brief research on Japanese history, it appears that Amakusa Shiro seems to be remembered as a Guy Fawkes-like figure, and is often villainised as the main antagonist in various works of fiction. Samurai Shodown is no different in this regard, and within this title's story canon, Amakusa is resurrected in 1788 as Anakuma from making a deal with the dark god Ambrosia by bringing the evil entity into the world by using the Palenque stone and its energy. Now driven by his hatred for the shogunate and having a nihilistic streak towards the world, he unleashes his dark powers to bring chaos to all of existence. So the plot of the game features a variety of warriors, some historic, some fictional, to converge upon the source of the chaos, each driven by their own reasons, which in turn gives the lineup of Samurai Shodown an exclusive to all fight in this game. The game opens up with a text crawl stating that a samurai fears not death, struggles to triumph over evil, and lives for one purpose: to destroy all enemies, which, in case you were wondering, is the quote that inspired the title of today's video. Yeah! After choosing a difficulty setting, characters can choose to play as one of 12 different characters, each of which we shall touch on soon. But first, let's cover over the last of the game's mechanics. We briefly touched on some of the weapon combat and rage gauges in this game, but what else does this title have to offer in terms of gameplay? Well, as expected, like in many fighting games, fights take place in 2 out of 3 falls matches. In Samurai Shodown's case, it offers an extra graphical touch by displaying a referee in the background to officiate the action. Samurai Shodown is often celebrated for its fast-paced gameplay. The title focuses on quick, powerful striking rather than combination maneuvers like with many other fighting games. Stylistically, the game also features the same zoom-in effect in battles that was pioneered in Art of Fighting the previous year. Slow motion effects have also been included to this game to further emphasise and intensify moments in which damage is dealt from hard hits. Splattering blood effects are also used in the game to emphasise the brutality even further. In terms of the controls, the game utilises the MVS's layout, giving players the ability to execute a light slash, medium slash, light kick and medium kick, which are each assigned to different buttons. More powerful moves, such as a long slash, for example, can be performed via the implementation of using certain button combinations. Using strong slashes triggers the game to use the slow motion effect, which we mentioned a few moments ago. The game's directional stick can also be tapped to allow players to run and jump backwards, while some characters can duck and crawl by tapping downwards. Body tosses are also performable when up close to opponents. Further from all of this, the game also features a lock-in sword system which can be triggered when players are in close power combat. When this happens, players take part in quick time events in a race to see who can repeatedly tap the light slash button the fastest. The winner in these instances will disarm their opponents, drastically reducing their attack power. Players who have lost their weapons do have the opportunity to pick their weapons back up, but obviously at the risk of being slain by their opponents in the process. The use of weapons in this game really helps the title mechanically stand out from what came before it. Now, as promised, let's quickly run through the colourful character lineup of this game and briefly touch on who they all are. Firstly, we have a character who is considered the star of the game, Heiyomaru, a Ronin who travels the land to sharpen his swordsmanship and his sense of Bushido. Further from this, we have Genin, a character we mentioned briefly at the beginning of this video. Genin strives to make himself more evil so that he can become the Demon King. Next up we have Hanzo Hattori, who is on a search for Amakusa after he took over his son's body. We have Jubi Yagyu, a hired Ronin who is looking for strong opponents to battle. Ukyo Tachiban, an ailing swordsman who is searching for the perfect flower for his love. Nakururu, who is searching for the cause of the plagues and disasters that disrupt Mother Nature. Charlotte Christian Cold, a noblewoman fencer from Versailles who comes to Japan to find the source of the disasters. Earthquake, an American ninja flunky turned bandit who wants to steal all of the world's treasure during the disasters. Galford D. Weller, an American surfer turned ninja who fights in the name of justice and is looking for any kind of evil to find and destroy. Kyoshiro Senryo, who is a famed kabuki performer who wishes to strengthen his dances through swordplay and fights to show off himself. There is Tam Tam, a renowned hero from the South American city of Green Hell, who fights to retrieve the sacred artifact, the Palenque Stone, and Wan Fu, a general from the Qing dynasty seeking to recruit powerful warriors for the unification of China. Further from this, the game also has a standard final boss encounter, in this game's case taking place against Shiro Takisada Amakusa, who, as we have mentioned, has been resurrected years after his death by the demon Ambrosia. Due to a pact made with the demon, he wants to revive Ambrosia into the mortal realm, thus destroying the world. The original version of the game would of course exist to be played on both the Neo Geo MVS and Neo Geo AES, and would go on to be awarded by Gamist magazine their Best Game of 1993 award, as well as winning the category of Best Fighting Game. Samurai Shodown placed first in their Best VGM, Best Album and Best Direction, and second place in the Best Graphics category. Gamist magazine would not be the only publication to shower the game with praise, as Electronic Gaming Monthly would love the game too. They would give Samurai Shodown several awards in 1993, including awards for the Best Neo Geo Game, Best Fighting Game and Game of the Year. The title would go on to receive another Game of the Year award too, this time from the European Computer Trade Show. As with many SNK games that hit the arcades, a few months later the title would be ported to a number of different formats in order to be able to sell their game to an audience as large as possible. By 1994, we were at that awkward period in time where there was a ridiculous amount of different consoles on the market. So this would mean that Samurai Shodown would in itself receive a ridiculous number of different home ports. Rather than talking about all of these different versions in depth, as I am sure it would be exhaustive and pointless at this point, let's just touch on a few of the versions' differences and how they were received by journalists at the time. Both the Sega Mega Drive and Sega Mega CD versions of this game would leave out the character Earthquake, along with his stage. Like the Mega Drive's port of Art of Fighting before it, these versions would also remove the gaming's zoom-in effects. Many attacks and maneuvers were also removed from these games. A number of other features were also cut from these versions, with obviously more being removed from the Mega Drive iteration than that of the Mega CD one. The Super Nintendo version of the game is argued by some to be better and including every single stage from the arcade game. Still though, there are features cut, such as the voice accompanying the text. In typical Nintendo censorship fashion though, all blood has been removed from this game and been replaced by sweat. Ugh. In regards to these two versions of the game, GamePro stated that the game is a rare case where the Genesis version is superior to the Super NES version, citing the Genesis version's better scaling and the awkward control configuration of the Super NES version. They would still advise fans though to pass up on both versions and wait a little bit longer so they could purchase the game on the 3DO. Eventually when released, the 3DO version would often be praised, with EGM calling it a very faithful home version of the arcade fighter. A reviewer for Next Generation went on to state that the 3DO conversion is nearly identical to the arcade version, much more faithful than the previous SNES, Genesis and Sega CD versions. To conclude today's video, did Samurai Shodown channel the samurai spirit by destroying all enemies? Well, personally, I think Samurai Shodown is so different to other fighting games of the period that it was able to stand on its own 2 feet, offering consumers something completely different to that of its competition altogether. Whether we are talking about games developed by Capcom or SNK's own in-house teams, Samurai Shodown is certainly one of the most novel fighters of its era and a fine addition to SNK's intellectual properties. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Samurai Shodown. If you enjoyed today's video, do not forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an upload. I present new videos celebrating fighting game history every Thursday on here. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of today's upload and what game you would like to hear me talk about next. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just that little bit less scary, so I'd like to thank all of you very much for that. Huge shout outs go out to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, SpongeMatt BYT, House of the Ted, Sin Spaces, Andrew Bazansky, Elsobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, Retroversing.com, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah!